Yeah, so welcome to this webinar series on statutory audits, concept to completion. Over the next 3 days, this is what we would cover. Today, we would cover an overview followed by a detailed approach to audit of assets and revenues. Tomorrow, we would cover liabilities and expenses. The day after tomorrow, we will cover how to prepare a Schedule 3 format. See, it's quite easy for me to, give you a Schedule 3 template and say, okay, you just drop down, it'll all get picked up automatically. But before I shared such a template, I thought I should just tell you how I have done it, because tomorrow when you try to apply it in your office and it shows an error or something, you'll know how to correct the formulae, and that's about it. And no template can, sort of prepare us completely. So we use only 3 formulae there: sum if, and maybe a VLOOKUP. That's all. Using just these 3, you can have a ready Schedule 3 template. All you do is paste your client's trial balance and do the classification, and then it gets pulled in automatically. Now, in this, I would like to emphasize on Schedule 3 as well, because I think the Schedule 3 disclosures have always been a problem with a lot of us, including myself. I find that sometimes I miss out something on Schedule 3. So we'll go through each part of it slowly. So it would last about 1 hour, extendable to 1.5 hours. So if there are any questions, I can take after that. So today's takeaway is basically going to be an Excel sheet which contains an audit checklist for every component of asset. I've also got a 26-point note on inventory verification, which is the riskiest item in the balance sheet that we are signing. And sometimes they call us only to do stock verification. So even for such engagements, this template would be very useful. So I would be showing you this Excel file where I have about 30 audit programs which I have put. Some of you may have seen this already. For the rest of you who haven't, I'll be walking you through this template insofar as it pertains to assets and revenues today, liabilities and expenses tomorrow. I'd also be walking you through this I'll again share this as a Word document. This is actually a work paper template for physical verification of inventories. So if at all I'd like to talk about something in detail today, it's going to be inventories, which are the biggest component of the balance sheet. And then I also have a small PowerPoint presentation, which is in terms of the overview itself. The fourth document that I would like to actually go through is actually the guidance note on Schedule 3. So today we will go through the guidance note very quickly on assets and revenues. Tomorrow we'll go through the guidance note on Schedule 3 on liabilities and expenses. And the last day would just be the Schedule 3 and a sort of a wrap up. So at the end of today, you'd get certain templates for use as well. So let me start with a very, very brief introduction. I hope you're able to see my PowerPoint. If you're not, someone can actually call me as well. This is about the statutory audits of small and medium companies, and my name is Sripriya Kumar. So what are we going to talk about? Very, very quickly, we'll talk about the audit process. How do you design and implement checklists? A sample checklist index, and key aspects of company audit. It's not 2018, it's 2021, which I'm not going to cover today, but I will cover on the last date. So this is largely for the benefit of very new or very young members who may be part of this webinar here today. What's a statutory audit? It's an audit where you express an opinion. This is usually true and fair. That's the objective. On the financial statements of an entity, whether profit-oriented or not. And these audits are based on something called as assertions. Assertions are what the management asserts about the financial statements. So somebody says, yes, my asset exists. That's an assertion. I have recorded it. That's an assertion. My rights and obligations are there. For this asset, I am the title holder. The land is in my name, etc. These are assertions. To satisfy that the assertions are in order, you perform audit procedures. Why do you perform audit procedures? Because tomorrow I am accountable for my work and I need to build audit evidence. Why? Because I'm giving an opinion, I need to have evidence. And where do I store all this? I store all this in audit documentation. Very briefly, what are my assertions? Hello? Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, you're able to see the screen now. I would possibly give speaking access to Mr. Ramesh Kumar, whom I know. So if there is an issue, he can talk in the middle also. So yeah, you're able to see the screen now.
I know.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the person who called. So, so what are my assertions? Assertions are what the management says exists. I'm not going to go into detail because this is a mature CA crowd that I'm dealing with, and I don't want to take your time explaining what assertions are. But I am now showing you the assertions because they are there in my Excel sheet where I have put out the audit program. So when you do an audit, you do a step. It has to target one of these assertions. Otherwise, there's no point in doing that particular step. So 1 minute. Just go back and mute. Yeah. So these are the assertions. So today, for example, if I'm looking for the title deeds during an audit, why do I look at the title deeds? Because I want to ensure that the right to the asset exists in the name of the company. So if I'm doing a cutoff procedure, I'm checking whether my sales have actually been dispatched. Why am I doing it? I'm doing it to ensure that my sales are properly stated and there are no cases of materials invoiced not delivered to the client. So each audit procedure has to attack an assertion, and when all assertions are happy and hunky-dory, your financial statements are true and fair, and so you will present an opinion that it is true and fair. What are the procedures that you perform? Again, why am I saying this? Because in your audit working papers, you will need to have evidence that you have covered all these assertions which are relevant to that particular component of the financial statements. You should demonstrate in sufficient measure that you have performed compliance procedures, which are tests of control, substantive procedures, which are tests of transactions and balances, and analytical review procedures, and you have performed risk assessment procedures to obtain audit evidence. This is a non-negotiable. Your audit working papers have to demonstrate what audit procedures you performed. So that's one way of looking at the audit procedures. What's the other? My working papers should also contain evidence of all these procedures that I performed. Oh, I observed the physical verification. It's there in my note. Enquiry. I inquired with the supplier. I got balance confirmations from banks. I got balance confirmations from debtors, creditors, etc. I've done an analytical review procedure. Why do I put it right on top? Because you always start the audit with an analytical review procedure to figure out how much you must audit. I've done inspection. I've inspected securities, let's say, charged to the bank. I've reperformed. My client gives me depreciation in an Excel sheet. My fixed asset registers maintained in an Excel sheet. I recompute the depreciation and check. I recompute the interest payable to banks. My client tells me if I press MeGo, GRN is getting accounted in SAP. I sit with him and say, okay, pass a MeGo now. He passes a MeGo and I see the inventory getting updated. That's a reperformance test. So essentially, your standard set of working papers will contain any or all of these audit procedures scattered across various components. For example, observation will come largely when you're observing. So it would find a place in your working papers or an inventory. For example, if it's a large cash count in a bank, you would be observing. You'd be observing fixed assets verification. Okay? So, and then you build audit evidence. I've always said this before. Today, please do look at the NAFRA reports on the Big Four which have been issued, the large firms, etc. You will be able to, I'm not getting into the merit or otherwise of that report, and I have no comment because that they are a statutory authority by themselves. Suffice to state that expectations and perceptions of the audit community has substantially changed. Today, it's not driven by solvency anymore. Today, auditors are taking responsibility for liquidity also in several things that you're saying. Next year is going to be even more difficult when your new Schedule 3, your new CARO comes into place. Now you have to just imagine. So this is one very nice way of doing it. You assume that each one of your cases can get reviewed tomorrow. So how will you write a letter to a client? How will you maintain your working papers? It's very simple. Think that somebody external is going to look at every paper in this audit. So prepare your papers to that effect. It's like a coin. One side is diligence, the other side is negligence. The thin rim is your working paper. Your coin can just tilt any which way depending on how good your working papers are. There is a separate standard on auditing on documentation. So I didn't really want to do standard on auditing as a separate segment simply because it really doesn't excite most of us. But of late, I've been thinking maybe, we should at least pick out 10 important lines from every standard on auditing and only do that in great detail. And all this is very important because you audit under GAAP, your generally accepted auditing principles, where you're given the benefit of sampling. And your audit evidence is always only persuasive rather than conclusive, which is why you need great working papers. And the standard on auditing on working papers documentation says that you must get your working papers ready within 60 days of conclusion of the audit, which is ample time. So today, before I just jump into the checklist, why do you need a checklist? I mean, frankly, some of you might say you can even skip this slide, and I would think so too. I need a checklist because it helps me to do an efficient audit. What's an efficient audit? All of us have a limitation on fee. A client is going to pay only 1.5 lakhs. So I need to mentally decide within 10 days X of time of article, staff, everything put together, 30 mandates, I have to finish this audit. I want to do an efficient audit. What's an effective audit? Within the time allotted, I have obtained maximum audit comfort. What is audit comfort? It's the comfort I need to give an opinion. I need to say it's true and fair, or it's not true and fair, or there is a qualification, there is a matter of emphasis, or there is a disclaimer. I need to arrive at that conclusion effectively. Today, it's a very complex requirement. Your risk of material misstatement, especially driven by COVID, is very, very high. You need to standardize work. Now, one thing about these templates is they cover 70% of any component. The remaining 30% will be unique to your client. So, for example, I may have put EPCG in. But if your client doesn't have EPCG, you can delete EPCG. But your client may have some other DEPB credits, for example, in which case you can put that in. You can delegate work. So this is something, again, I've always said, you play the role of a mentor. So whether for ourselves or not, I think we have an obligation to work in a structured manner for the articles we train, because I think it's very important for them to learn things the right way. So that's possibly the only reason why all of us spend a little more time doing these templates and sign-offs and things like that, because it inculcates a very, very strong, and let's face it, this is one of the few professions where you get the chance to mold the next generation. And so, and the millennials, of course, are very, very smart. So if you teach them something, they will do a lot of jazz and come back to it later. And the other interesting thing why you need to maintain a great working paper is because you get something called CAKE, cumulative audit knowledge. So today, if I'm doing fixed assets and I've assigned it to a staff, I'll ask them to take last year's fixed asset papers and start from there. It's the easiest way of an on-the-job training. Now, what are the key checklist categories I've prepared? Client acceptance, continuance, and audit planning. I'm not planning to cover this in this session. I will only walk you through that checklist. Then I have assets, liabilities, contingent liabilities, income and expense audit programs, and special purpose checklists, which I'm not covering now. But the box 1 and box 2 is contained in the Excel file, which we will quickly go through from now. So are there any questions till now which I should take, or I should continue? Would someone like to put some questions till now, or should I continue? Okay. Mr. Ashok says continue. Thank you very much. So I will continue. So I start with my Excel templates. Just this template should cover 70% of your audit. So what's all there in this template? Acceptance, continuance. So every time you accept a client, you're supposed to put it here. You're supposed to assess your client, a KYC. You will find a checklist certificate under section 141, which is the certificate that you give saying I am eligible and I am not ineligible as per the Companies Act. I'm not disqualified. If it's a new audit, you have to get an NOC from the retiring auditor. You have to sign an engagement letter with the client. In what format should I sign the engagement letter? Please sign it in the format which ICAI has given. I'll walk you through that. There is a particular sheet here called engagement letter. All you have to do is just click. If ICOFER is applicable, you click here, go through this, get it signed. If ICOFER is not there, then you get this template signed. Now, that's the most important thing here itself. You will know whether your client, whether there is ICOFER or not ICOFER. The entitlement or the criteria for threshold is also given here. And in doing this, just ensure you are within the numbers which have been specified by the institute in terms of the number of audits that you can do. Once you take over an engagement, you will come to a checklist. So each of these are given a checklist, which is self-explanatory. This is under SQC1. It's an acceptance checklist. What do I do in my acceptance checklist? I basically say, okay, can I accept this client? Am I able to assess him? Do I have the competence? Somebody comes to me, he's into derivatives trading. As a firm, do I know enough to take this over? Should I get somebody new? Have I looked at the last year's financials? Am I independent? Can I accept this engagement? Do I have any other conflict of interest with any other client and where the client says, no, you can't do the other client? Have I satisfied my past auditor the communication? Very interestingly, now the latest thing says where an auditor has resigned, there is supposed to be a handshake between the earlier auditor and the new auditor, and you're supposed to find out whether there were any key audit issues. Does my practice team have the relevant skills, experience, specialization, etc.? This is something you as part of SQC are supposed to review for yourself. It's very important. This is for a new client. Situation is pretty much the same with just some additional questions for a continuance checklist. And then, so it's more or less the same criteria which is specified so that it helps you to assess how much of work you're going to spend, etc. And you build that knowledge. Why do we do this? Because audit is always top down. I don't start from a voucher. I first start from understanding my client year on year, month on month, and then I go and audit my vouchers. The sheet under consent of 139 is kept here. Whatever you're supposed to give in your consent certificate. If there is a DC matter, please state so. Doesn't matter. It's up to the client to take or not take. Engagement letter. The two formats were given above. If ICOFER is applicable, if ICOFER is not applicable. NOC from the previous auditor. It's a matter of professional ethics. We've always been doing it. There are other circumstances which can emerge, and those would have to be treated on a case-to-case basis. Then you prepare a template where you understand the client's business. So as far as I am concerned, I have not come yet into the core of my presentation. The core of my presentation today was assets and liabilities, but these templates ought to be filled because in the process of your spending a little time on understanding this, you will be able to dimension your own audit risk. What is the basic data? Ownership and governance, industry dynamics, accounting system and internal controls, key laws and regulations impacting the client business. Now I just unhid the headings. What all is there? This is what you will fill up. Basic data. Ownership and governance. Why? Who are my shareholders? Who's the KMP? Who's the director? Is there an independent director? Who are all the related parties to this company? Industry dynamics. Accounting system and internal controls. SOPs. Are they available? Is there a delegation of powers? Is there an IT environment? Do I have ITGC controls? Key laws and regulations, etc. This is perhaps the most important template. You are expected per the standard of asset auditing to assess the risk of material misstatement. So let's just step one back. So what's the statutory audit all about? It's only about two things. One, the financial statements presented to me are true and fair. What does true and fair mean? It means only two things. One, there is no risk of material misstatement. See, 5,000, 10,000, 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, 50 lakhs. Depending on the client's balance sheet size, there could be errors. They are not material. I should not have a material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. And the second most important thing is it has to be in compliance with the applicable accounting framework, which is your Schedule 3. So how do I assess the risk of material misstatement? See, it's such a wide term, right? Because in a material misstatement, the drivers are the tone at the top. In fact, if you read several surveys on frauds that have come, the frauds today happen because of management overrides of controls. Lots of large organizations, everything is great. Suddenly somebody comes and says, okay, you book the sale, pass this JV. He says, I will override all my controls. We'll create one warehouse, we'll send our items there, and we will book it as a sale. What's your biggest risk today? How do you ensure that such overrides don't happen? How big risks don't happen, whether due to fraud or error? The tone at the top. Market-related conditions. See, there is a lot of pressure on these quarterly reporting companies. I have to show share price movement. I have to keep my investors happy. Personnel. So if it's a bad year, somebody will be prone to making an adjustment entry. The banker's saying, no, I can't give you working capital next year. So you just inflate your book stocks. You inflate your receivables. You show a higher working capital entitlement. You've taken a larger working capital funding. These are pressures that cause financial statements to be materially misstated. Personnel related. Very important, right? If your client has a qualified CFO, it's very easy to work with them then. Most of the things, that's one thing very sad about the Companies Act. While it pushes so much responsibility on the auditor, it doesn't make one statement to say that the CFO of any company which is above, let's say, 50 crores or 100 crores should be a chartered accountant. A lot of us have challenges explaining even a Schedule 3 to the accountant to say this is how it should be done. But that's very important. See, a lot of times when you do the audit, you say, okay, Mr. Ramesh is handling fixed assets. He's quite good. So generally things will be okay. So the personnel related is very important. Have there been big exits? See, all this will help you to identify how much of audit you want to do and how much deeper are you going to audit. So today there have been frequent movements. The CFOs quit and gone. I do a lot of work on that audit. Accordingly, your fee will have to be different. Internal controls, internal audit, fraud, whistleblower. So one of the advantages is when you fill up things like this, automatically it will go and rest in your mind. Where do I think I'll have a Caro problem? Where do I think I will have an ICOFER reporting problem? Where could I have a base number problem in my financial statements? All of this is possible. So for example, if there is extreme profit pressure, somebody could understate depreciation. So I will not capitalize my asset. I'll just keep it like that in CWIP. Is there a possibility? Yes. If that possibility is there, can it result in a material misstatement? Yes. Let's say I have 10 crores CWIP. I have not capitalized it. It's a big difference, right? It could be a crore of depreciation. Now, these are my basic templates based on which I will prepare an audit planning memorandum. Now, my only request is kindly go through this entire cycle. In a lot of cases for small companies, you don't have to prepare all this. What do you cover in an audit planning memorandum? First of all, this is very important. I will ask myself, okay, what all work I have to do for this client? Now, of course, GST audit is gone, so it could be a GST review. The client can say, okay, you look at my GST also separately. Statutory audit, limited review, tax audit, GST review, transfer pricing, special certifications. There could be a return of deposit. There could be an EPCG certification. So the most important thing is you do it all in one shot. Don't keep saying, I'll do this now, do that later. No, you can cover your work parallelly. Similarly, what are all the entities? I have an entity, my parent, my subsidiary, my associate, my entities abroad. Who's going to do? Am I going to do it? Or is it going to be done by another auditor? Again, in this day and age, you'll need a lot of coordination with other people you work with. In my opinion, this is one of the best ways to start an audit. You first go and map last year and previous year numbers, fixed assets, investments, inventories, all the components, the big numbers, see where the movements are. Based on this, you look at the key ratios. You decide on the risk and the materiality. High risk, high materiality for a particular component, lots of audit. High risk, low materiality, low audit. Low risk, low materiality, no audit. I won't even touch it. But that risk assessment comes from other things. For example, rent. It's a very low risk component. Why? Because my company will declare to me, I've got 10 rental premises, I've got 10 agreements, multiplied by 12 should be my rental payment. For my additional comfort, I will only download that form 26AS and see if I've remitted TDS. Finished. You don't need to audit rent for more than 15-20 minutes. It will get over. So very low level of audit effort. It helps you to make up your mind internally on what's the easiest way to get audit comfort. Commencement and conclusion date. I'm auditing the head office, the factory, the branch, other places. When do I want to start? When do I want to finish? Am I going to do an interim audit? Am I going to go in September, October? Again, given these COVID conditions, it's very, very important you finish off an interim. Tell all your clients to please close one's accounts. At least by November, let me finish interim and then I will do my final in April or May. Similarly, what is the kind of audit you want to do? See, these are all just given very briefly, but you can go in the right side and write how much ever you want. And today, your standards on auditing also permit you to maintain your working papers in e-form. So at the end of it, just PDF this and put it in. That's it. So you can decide each component wise. And today, what's the easiest way to audit an SME is to audit by component. Fixed assets, inventory, investment. So you create each bunch. So in the place where I did my articles, fixed assets for any client would always be called A. Investments, inventories, revenues and receivables, cash and bank, loans and advances, assets. Liabilities would be share capital, AA, reserves and surplus, secured loans, unsecured loans, current liabilities, provision for taxation, contingent liabilities, CARO checklist, Schedule 3 checklist. So it becomes very simple. So for example, you should ask one of your articles to do a Schedule 3 checklist and say, please go through the Schedule 3 as presented, go to the guidance note, put a tick here if every aspect of the guidance note has been cleared. If it is not, you mention what I'm not complying as per the guidance note. Makes for a very effective audit. Previous audit reports, internal audit. Another very important thing. So if there is no internal audit, then that is also a problem. If the company is covered under section 138, where internal audit is mandatory, it should be there. Again, next year's CARO, they got very smart. The new CARO that's coming, they are saying, is internal audit commensurate? Have reports been received? Have you considered the reports properly? They're asking you 3 specific questions. Currently in CARO, there is no internal audit, but that internal audit clause was there in CARO 2003, which has now been brought back. The team. So these are the expectations of your standard on auditing. Who is your team? Who is the engagement partner? Who is the review partner? Who are the qualified assistants? Who are the article assistants? Are you going to take any experts, actuaries? You have to write your actuarial evaluation, etc. Lawyers, other CAs. Materiality threshold. Again, when I started off, I said an audit is a risk. It's an opinion. Your financial statements must be free from material misstatements. So today, I will tell my office, under 3 lakhs, please don't see anything. That is my materiality threshold. Just record it. Don't pass an entry. I will add everything under 3 lakhs and finally see the total amount. If that is also coming to only 10, 12 lakhs, I might decide not to pass the entry this year. I'll pass it in the next year itself. So that's your materiality threshold, or you can say that any P&L account under 2 lakhs, I will not check. Why? Because I have 50 accounts under 2 lakhs, the sum total of which is coming to only 1 crore or less than that. My total P&L is 50 crores. I will see the top 5 expenses. Absolutely allowed insofar as you have a rational basis for that decision. And again, there are threshold items. It's a very small profit. Those kind of companies, you have to be very careful. Statutory non-compliances, there is no threshold. For fraud, there is no threshold. It's very important. While for fraud reporting, there is a threshold. You can't say, okay, he only stole cash, little cash only. It was only 2,000 rupees. No, you have to be very careful about those components. With these, so let me just run you through this again. So I had kept an acceptance checklist, which you fill up when you acquire a new client, a continuance checklist, the consent form, an engagement letter, a no objection certificate. You start by first understanding and documenting the client's business. All of this will be one attachment. For example, for this, the attachment will be the IT policy. SOP will be the SOP document. DOA will be the letter of limits of authority document. So it is not that you're, going to write everything here. You will just attach that reference document. And again, your documentation also speaks of 2 kinds of documents you maintain as an auditor. One is called as the permanent note file, and the second is your current year file. Permanent note file is where I will keep my memorandum, my articles, my SOPs, my LOA, things which are likely to be more permanent than changing every year. And in your current audit working papers, you will keep only your current documents. Now, let's go and start with every component of the financial statement. So I'm just going to stop for a minute here, because if anybody wants to, sort of question or something, then I can, can you hide the screen sharing message? Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, you can apply mathematical models for materiality, but in the case of SMEs, we don't do it. I'll come to it towards the end. Maybe on the last day, I will take up materiality, and if you had attended the ICOFER session, it would have been helpful. You can do some mathematical definition of materiality. Yes, I will take materiality as a separate class on Saturday for about 10 minutes. Yeah. So now we go to the main checklist. I'm going to do the assets, and if time permits, revenues also, but otherwise we can conclude with assets. So for all these templates, there is a common standard. The common standard is that it reflects the assertions. There is a procedure which covers every part of the process. So in that sense, if you see, this marries internal audit, ICOFER, and statutory audit requirements. Let me explain to you how. So if you understand one, the scheme of building is the same thing. Now, when I'm approaching a fixed asset, what is important? First of all, any audit, previous year total and the current year opening balance should tally. For fixed assets, I need to get the block schedule. My fixed asset register should reconcile with my general ledger. I need to have an accounting policy or a delegation of authority document. So these are all broadly for fixed assets, anybody. For example, a capital budget, if it's a large company. Now let's come to processes on fixed asset. In a fixed asset, what all can happen? I can have an addition, which I must audit to make sure that there is no material misstatement in addition. I have not at all accounted the addition, or I've accounted an asset which was never in my factory, which has not even come inside, or I've accounted it wrongly, or I've accounted it for the wrong date. So how do I check that these 4 risks on fixed assets don't happen? By performing these procedures. You take the total additions, you find whether there is a budget approval for these additions, which is more to do with ICOFER than to do with your statutory audit process. For a sample of addition, I need to ensure that there is a supplier invoice. My item has been delivered. It has been capitalized as per my accounting standard. Depreciation has started ticking. All costs connected to the acquisition have been included. Similarly, in fixed assets, you will have to test deletions. I will check only 5 deletions. My total deletion is 2.5 crores. I can check 1.75 crores, more than enough. Top 5 assets, top 10 assets. In deletion, most important is my profit and loss on sale. Profit or loss on sale, whether it is accounted properly. Is there a TCS element which should have been considered? Has it been scrapped? These are important. Personal revenue expense. So in an asset, what can happen? Addition, deletion, personal revenue mix-up can happen. Specific. Today, I have, as an organization, capitalized a huge amount. 150 crore capitalization has happened. 25 crores capitalization has happened. You need to ensure that the capitalization has happened correctly, which is basically when I accumulate my CWIP, it will be CWIP debit to supplier. And when I capitalize, I will credit CWIP and debit my fixed asset. Has the debiting happened correctly? My Forex, my government grants, my EPCG benefits, have they all been treated correctly? So you had addition, deletion, large capitalization, personal revenue. Now fixed physical verification. Now even CARO says that, right? Whether you have a proper management protocol for periodic verification once in 2 years. Now, so many physical verification reports, they will say management has carried out. Excellent, no problem. You must ask for a copy of the physical verification report. First of all, we all have a problem with fixed asset register itself. The register will have one line: cement, sand, labor charges, freight charges, and you won't even know to which asset it has gone. So first of all, your client should have a decent fixed asset register. Secondly, when you ask them for a physical verification report, they will give an italics bracket and then they will say verified. That's clearly not acceptable. And especially when you go to the italics bracket, there will be pipes, fittings, etc. 10,82,000. You ask them, how did you verify this? So the fundamental building block is a fixed asset register, which ought to be properly maintained. All expenses connected to a fixed asset, at least they should be showing it under the mother asset name. And obviously, all your fixed asset register, I've again discussed in a separate bracket, but physical verification, as an auditor, please test. Do book to physical and do physical to book. Both are equally important. Idle unutilized asset, control over asset movements. They give you a fixed asset register. They say everything is there in the factory, whereas you see some assets are sitting in the subcontractor's premises. So whether the location is tagged correctly. Depreciation. Please check compliance to new Companies Act 2013. Many of us have still not gone. I will show you 2 templates in Excel which are attached herewith, which are self-explanatory. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but that can help you to actually create a new fixed asset register for a client. The fixed asset register, whatever is mandatorily prescribed, asset code, asset name, asset description, location, supplier, invoice reference, what is the expense capitalized, what is the block value, what is the depreciation, what is the next block, net block. See, all of us understand that clients have limitations. But if the client has a 50 crore, 100 crore asset base, there's no reason why he can't spend a few lakhs and have his fixed asset register documented properly, especially in the context that he's even gotten a bank loan and a working capital facility. See, they can't crouch on all the wrong things. If this needs to be maintained, it needs to be maintained, and it's non-negotiable. And the same thing I'd like to sensitize you in the context of income tax audits, tax audits. They say, what are the books and records maintained? Please don't say, if he's not maintaining a fixed asset register, why are you saying he's maintaining one? So let's get the client to actually implement these things because they are quite fundamental. Revaluation, there is also a reference in Schedule 3. So progressively also it's going to happen. And in the next incoming Schedule 3, they are saying if it's more than 10% for each category, whether such valuation has been carried out by a registered valuer. But this is for now, you have to handle the revaluation, title and insurance. So normally what happens is any control weakness, which is not material, you give a separate letter to the client called as an ML, a management letter. That's not a management representation letter. You say during the course of our statutory audit, we have come across all these issues. Please take care. These are all control issues. Special categories of assets, concessional duty schemes, the scientific research for income tax, deferred taxation. Be very, very careful. You must calculate your deferred tax asset or liability properly. And when I do the deferred tax portion tomorrow, I'll try and explain to you in a very simple manner what my understanding of deferred tax is. And that's a very simple way to understand whether the deferred tax is correctly stated. CWIP, again, look at it. It's become a Schedule 3 aspect next year. They want you to show CWIP separately. Aging of CWIP. Why is there a delay in the CWIP? What are my delayed projects? What are my abandoned projects? So this year, when you do all this audit, please cognize for next year's Schedule 3 because anyway, you have to give prior year comparatives. Again, today, given this pandemic situation, one is not very clear on whether this is all going to come or not come, but it's better to be prepared. So the reason why I discussed this template in detail is because for everything, this is the same standard. Assertions are put. Audit procedure for every sub-process of an asset or a liability is covered. So for fixed assets, it's addition, deletion, capitalization, fixed asset register, overall procedures, depreciation, idle assets, revaluations, CWIP. So those are my key. So you know, mentally, if there's no CWIP, then you can even delete this audit program. So now let's take a short detour and let's see what. I'm not going to walk through this in detail, but I hope you're able to see my screen of the guidance note. I'd just like to expose you to the guidance note. That's about it. So is my screen visible on the guidance note? Yeah, so this is the guidance note. So please do look at the guidance note on Schedule 3. It's given very neatly. Fixed assets. What all should you show? Tangible, intangible, CWIP, intangible under development. What is tangible asset should be only within this definition. Similarly, assets under lease, reconciliation. This is how you prepare the gross schedule, right? Gross block. Opening, addition, deletion, closing balance, depreciation for the period, closing balance, net block. This is actually the science behind why you present it the way you do. Intangible assets, again, these are the headings. This is non-negotiable. You can't change all this. CWIP, assets under development. That's your schedule, your guidance note on Schedule 3. Now, the second aspect is your investments. Now, let me start similarly with investments. I'm not going to go into it in great detail. By the way, sorry. In fixed assets, I have given you how to create a fixed asset register. Let's say your client doesn't have a fixed asset register at all. How do you help them to create? You go put one by one from the last asset bought. And then the opening, what you can't discover is the balancing figure. That's the only way you can build it. So I have kept one to build a fixed asset register in SLM and one in WDV. Now, these templates serve two purposes. You can also use it as a reperformance test. Let's say your client is showing 10 lakhs bought in a particular year. So 15/7, 2001 he bought. This asset today should stand at 20,000 rupees for me as per the new Companies Act. It's a ready reckoner. Similarly, I have done a ready reckoner for WDV for you to test. If my client, of course, most of us are capable of building it ourselves. This is just a template I have given. So I had built across the years to see how much that value should be as of our current year. And I had also built out the disposals, etc. So you can just play with it. It's just a very complex Excel template which actually worked. It's very easy to understand. You'll be able to crack this. The next you come to is investments. Similarly, in investments, I have the same logic. The second asset, I have my assertions. What are my processes in investments? Overall procedures, same thing, correct? My tally is showing investments of 82 crores, 50 lakhs, blah, blah, blah. Same number should be there in my investment register. Additions during the year, disposals during the year, Schedule 3 disclosure requirements, accretions to investments, income from investments, valuation of investments, any other aspects. I've just left the others free. So you're covering the entire life cycle of investments: addition, deletion, dividend, interest, holding in own name, 186 compliance, my authorization to invest. Everything comes in one comprehensive template. One very peculiar problem I have found in the process of my review. Again, I'll tell you the most important thing. You have invested in a company, your client. How do you know that company exists? It's a huge fraud angle that you need to examine. In a lot of cases, my client would have got 20 crores bank loan. He has given 18 crores to another company, invested in that company. 16 crores is share premium, 2 crores is the share capital. You as an auditor, please make sure that that entity at least exists on MCA records and get a confirmation. Another very interesting fraud angle is your client puts 18 crores in that company and forgets all about it. Would anybody do it as a common person? No. Right? I put 18 crores somewhere. Either I have to get a return on investment or that company has to be doing. In a lot of cases, these downstream investments were used to launder money. Please be very, very careful. Your client could be absolutely dormant. There will only be a 30 crore receipt of money from a group company and given 30 crore investment to another group company. But the 30 crore of receipt could have come from a bank loan in some other company. Please be very, very careful. Now, what does Schedule 3 talk about it? It says non-current investments shall be classified as trade investments and other investments. This is again non-negotiable. You have to show it like this only. Property, equity, preference, government or trust, debentures, mutual funds, partnership firms, other non-current investments. Most important thing, several times I have seen balance sheets where the name is not given, not allowed. Under each classification, details shall be given of the names of the body corporate, indicating separately. So I have invested, I have to say whether it is a subsidiary, an associate, a joint venture, or a controlled SPV. And in case of investment, in the case of partnership firms, the name of the firm, names of all the partners, total capital, and share of each partner shall be given. And of course, your provisions will apply. Trade investments. Non-current investments shall be classified as trade investments, other investments. So the disclosures flow therefrom. Basis of valuation. Schedule 3 requires the basis of valuations which are carried other than at cost. And then you make a provision for diminution. At cost, cost less provision for other than temporary diminution, lower of cost of market value. If it is quoted, it's fairly obvious. It's a quoted investment. How should you disclose partnership firms? So everything is specified, and I think it's one of the very, very well written guidance notes where it's very clear for you what to do. There is no ambiguity at all. Inventories. Okay. Inventory again, I have a special paper to show you. So again, in inventory, it's the same story. I have an overall procedure. Opening should reconcile to closing of last year. But my closing of this year is coming from outside, right? There is a verification, there is a valuation, then there is a identifying my closing stock in my balance sheet. In an inventory, what is my process? Receipts, issues, inventory ledgers need to be maintained properly. Control over issues, inventory custody, inventory ledgers, write-offs and inventory adjustments, inventory verification, inventory valuation, each category shown separately, inventory provisions. Am I making, it's called SLOB, slow moving, obsolete, blocked inventory, slow moving, non-moving, obsolete, damaged inventory. And in addition to this, there will be in all these checklists, I haven't written it specifically because I prefer a separate Schedule 3 checklist, but this is a more dynamic idea, is to have one more category in all your checklists as Schedule 3 disclosure. All aspects of disclosure are complied with. This can be a standard question for your apprentice or yourself to fill up. That's it. So the other advantage is if I file this as paper number 11, every attachment I can add, paper number 11.1, is my receipt testing. I tested 50 receipts. So I can call this as 11.1. Or this can be 11.1. Opening balance and closing balance is tallied. 11.2. Obtained and kept in 11.2. So each paper then becomes. Now you can also do one thing, you can move this itself to a separate folder, your audit folder of inventories, and in that you can keep all these papers together. So what does Schedule 3 talk about inventories? There is a very clear disclosure. Raw materials, WIP, FG, stock and trade, stores and spares, loose tools, others. This becomes even more important next year. They say if there is a variance between book and physical in each category, you have to report separately. What is the category they're talking about? This is the category. Goods in transit has to be disclosed separately. Mode of valuation shall be stated, and all this should be there. All trading should be shown separately. It is not shown under finished goods. Small things, but very relevant. Now, one of the most important things I think for a statutory auditor is inventory verification. So I'm just going to take a few minutes, unlike the usual webinars which run for 1 hour, since this is slightly longer, it might run for about 1 hour, 20 minutes, and then we can taper on the questions. I am going to leave this document with you. This is a must print, must sign document by both you and your client. So I have basically put out 26. It's called A to Z of inventory counts. It's completely, I had thought through this and put this. This is what you need to satisfy yourself that you're a diligent auditor. The company, however small, needs to have a policy. You must have custodian verification as well as independent verification. Inventory verification needs to be carried out on a periodic basis, and all items of inventory are covered at least once a year. I wouldn't give it 2 years. Cycle count must be there. So it's called wall-to-wall count. See, if you go to a huge auto company, you can't cover anything. They'll do little every year. That's your perpetual count. Before the count, I as an auditor, see today, auditor does not count inventory. Auditor observes the counting of the inventory. You can count if you want, but I wouldn't do that. So you tell the client to count and you will observe. You can also send your staff to count. All categories of inventory should be covered. All inventory in all the locations. Very conveniently, they will leave out one go down. They will leave out one locked room. Don't. Then they'll say you come and count it later. No. All intermediary storage locations, floor stock needs to be covered. Temporary warehouses. Book stock must be there. Sometimes the client, if he doesn't have a book stock, what will you count? You will only take the physical, is it? You have to be careful. Written stock verification instructions must be issued before the count. Cut-off references are obtained. Verification protocols should ensure that the stocks are verified batch-wise. See, if you go to a large FMCG go down, see again, this is a very agnostic Word document. Let's say I am going to do depot verification for Hindustan Lever. This is equally relevant as it is to your own statutory audit client. The auditor verifying the inventory is provided for a floor plan. Now today, if you're counting this coal and all that, you have to be even more careful. They will make something called as a trapezoidal stack. If you've seen the coal, if you've seen the small granite, you know, those little things that we call karungal in Tamil. So those little jelly kind of, they will make these trapezoidal blocks. Almost invariably when you count coal, when you verify coal, they'll tell you, madam, there is carpet loss. They'll say all the coal has gone under the ground. So that also we have to add. Please be very careful. During the count verification sheets should be serially controlled. To each article you're giving one paper, give him 10. Page number 1 to 10 is with you, 11 to 20 is with you. Even if he doesn't use it, he will strike it and bring it back. If count is not completed on the same day, the location must be sealed. This is equally relevant when you're going as a stock auditor for a bank stock audit also. You must seal it, countersign it, make sure that they don't break open the seal without your permission. See, honestly, in this day and age, I would trust nobody because it's you as an auditor, it's your head on the block, so you better be careful. See, if somebody feels bad that you're asking them to seal it, you tell them this is the protocol. No movements permitted during verification. Count sheets are maintained for a defined period of time. Stock sheets are signed by the client. Everybody must sign all the papers after the count. Final verification report, you will get your book versus physical. You have to reconcile. You have to pass adjustment entries. Tomorrow, one clerk cannot pass an adjustment entry, right? If I'm reporting a stock excess of 1 crore and a stock short of 1 crore, somebody in the senior management has to say, excess, how can it happen? Correct? Unless there is a dispatch error or a receipt error, excess is all mine only. I could have done a short dispatch, but shortages have to be investigated separately. Backup to adjustment entries are printed and filed. Why? Because this is called as a JV. What entry do you pass? You pass an entry which affects two P&L accounts in the general ledger. It's not going through a sub-ledger. You have to be very, very careful. You credit stock and debit inventory loss, correct? And take it to the P&L. Access to personnel for accounting verification related adjustments are restricted. VAT or SENVAT or GST impact. If you have to expunge or something, you have to handle. Professional skepticism is applied. Trust, but most certainly verify. Extremely important. And this is a standard checklist which you actually sign off at the end of the count, and it's critical. Please ensure that everything is covered on the same day or within concurrent dates, because suddenly they would come back and say, no, I forgot to count that location. That's not permitted. Now I'm back to my Excel screen and I hope you can see my screen. I've just stopped sharing for a minute. You were able to see my screen? Yeah, thanks, Mr. Ashok. So I go back to my Excel template now. So So we finished inventories. Then we go to the fourth component, which is revenues and receivables. So what does this comprise? So normally when you do an audit, you cover the revenue and the receivables simultaneously. You don't take it separately because what we try and do is a balance sheet audit with limited P&L testing. So both these are closely related, right? So coming back to this template, it's virtually the same thing. I have assertions, I have procedures, I have a work paper reference, I have exceptions. I call it as box number 12, file number 12. In fact, one thing that a lot of organizations do is they standardize this number 12. 12 in any client will only be revenues and receivables. If inventory as a bunch is not there, you will say 11 not applicable. That's all. If it's a software company, where is the inventory? So in inventory, what are my overall, my processes? Sorry, in revenue and receivables, overall procedures, control over master data. That's equally relevant for inventories, but mine is only an indicative checklist. Order processing, invoice. Am I picking the product and then raising the invoice, or am I raising the invoice and then picking? There could be a problem. So there has to be a logical method to any client's operation. Is my invoice accurate? Is it in the proper format? Is it acknowledged by the customer? Dispatch and sales booking. I dispatch, then I book my sale. Once I update my lorry receipt, only my sale entry should ideally get booked. But most clients don't do that. The moment I will go into Tally, raise an invoice. Which is why when you're doing an audit, if that automated control of dispatch is not there, then you will do more audit. You have to go and ask for the LRs and check those LRs. Collection accounting. Management of dishonors becomes very important. Debit and credit notes. Can somebody, again, debit and credit note is a JV. You have to be very, very careful. Can anybody give a credit note to a customer? No, you have to be careful. Similarly, you should also examine this. Can a credit note result in evergreening of receivables? My client has to give me 1 crore from last year. I go to the client ledger. My client says, I have homegrown ERP. So the client has to give 1 crore to your client, meaning the client's customer has to give 1 crore. I go in my homegrown ERP. I pass a credit note for 1 crore today, and the same day I pass a debit note for 1 crore. My aging can change, no? Because the computer can recognize the last debit transaction as the date of sale. Please be a little careful about these things, especially on homegrown ERPs. Your aging could be completely wrong. Balance confirmations. Very, very important. Dealt with under external confirmations. There is a protocol for it. Ideal is auditor to dispatch the letters themselves or send the mails themselves, receive it, reconcile it, and close it. In fact, this was the biggest issue in Satyam, right? They did not get a direct bank confirmation. They got it through the client who gave them beautifully crafted system-generated statements. Aging of receivables. Why is aging important? Because Schedule 3 wants me to give aging. And unless I comply with Schedule 3 and that presentation and disclosure is correct, I cannot be stated to be true and fair. So E is existence, occurrence, completeness, rights and obligations, valuation, presentation and disclosure. These are my assertions. Review of legal files. Very, very important. Why? See, revenue impairment because of a non-recoverability of a receivable is the most obvious problem anybody would have. And litigation only fuels such non-recoverable. So please go through your legal files. And another very important thing is they say, regardless of materiality, I'll do it when I come to P&L also. Professional fees, legal fees, rates and taxes, penalties, all these accounts you always review. Miscellaneous expenses. Even if the account has nothing, you have to do a GL review. Forex, cutoff testing, etc. So this is only an indicative. I've done it from A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. 11 aspects I've set out. You may have more, you may have less. So for example, if your client has a digital invoicing platform, so as soon as everything is online, then you may have to build that separately. Some controls for that. We come to the next asset, which is cash and bank. So cash is fairly straightforward. What is my process on cash? Overall procedures, which is essentially my opening balance. Control over cash receipts, control over cash payments, cash custody, cash verification, cash insurance. So that's what we've got here. Control over receipts, control over payments, cash custody, cash insurance, cash verification, presentation and disclosure. So how does the Act want me to do disclosure? For trade receivables, aggregate amount greater than 6 months, lesser than 6 months, good, unsecured considered good, considered doubtful, provision for bad debts, debts due by directors. Please go through this very carefully. Trade receivables, if there are any debts due by directors or other officers, also has to be shown. Now, next year Schedule 3 becomes even more complicated because they want you to show due from MSME, other dues, good, disputed, good, other dues, good, disputed. And they also say unbilled dues receivables should be shown separately. Unbilled dues should be shown separately. And it goes one more level. They say if you don't know what is the date on which the item is due, the date of invoice will be taken as the date of due. So a lot of our clients may not have a credit period, in which case for aging purpose, the date of bill becomes the date of due. Cash and cash equivalents, bank balances, checks, drafts on hand, cash on hand, others, earmarked balances, unpaid dividends, etc. shall be shown separately. Margin money shall be shown separately. Repatriation restrictions shall be shown separately. Bank deposits with more than 12 months maturity shall be shown separately. These are very, very important. Okay, this is for both cash and bank. Now, similarly, I have a bank template. What do I talk about in the bank template? Same thing. Overall procedures, control over receipts. Now, why am I using the word control over receipts? Because all this that I present here are also some compliance procedures, right? So this is a compliance procedure. Control over payment is a compliance test. Bank confirmation is a substantive procedure. BRS is a substantive procedure. It can come for both. So control over creation and deletion of bank accounts, control over receipts, overall procedures, control over payments, BRS, custody of blank forms and instruments. Now, the biggest problem that all our clients today, we must be very, very careful with is all these e-modes of payment. Are they secure? Are they sharing passwords? All these are very, very important. And the most important thing in an audit, see, this BRS is something we Now, of course, there are these system BRS, etc. So it should be a lesser issue. Now, in platforms like SAP, you actually have all your uncleared items in a separate account called as bank clearing account. So if you take SAP, every day the main bank balance will be equal to bank statement balance, and the other transactions will feature in your clearing account. But in Tally, you're supposed to do this manually, and be very, very careful with the BRS. You must have a BRS master template. Name of the bank account, month, BRS done, BRS reviewed, entries passed. Please get this overall thing signed by the client for all months, because tomorrow if there is a fraud, then you have something to go back on. Similarly, when you do a BRS, don't do it blindly. In this day and age, can you have a check issued not presented? Will somebody not present a check? Try and think about this. Similarly, check deposited not credited. Can I have something beyond 15 days, 10 days, 5 days? Impossible. Why would you deposit a check in a bank for it not to get credited? Just go one level lower. The last category of assets that I'm going to talk about today and the final part of my presentation. In fact, these are intended to be 1 hour primarily because I thought 2 hours is like too long for anybody to focus and make it meaningful, and somehow I feel it loses its joy. So the last segment is loans and advances. So let's first go to Schedule 3. What does Schedule 3 talk about loans and advances? Short-term loans and advances to related parties, others. Again, must hasten to add that next year there is a significant change in this. Considered good, unsecured, considered good, considered doubtful, due by directors or other officers of the company, you will have a straight 185 violation. Because 185 says you cannot give a loan to a director or his relative. You can only give it to another entity where it is used for principal business purposes with a special resolution. Please be very, very careful. If there is a due by a director, then there has to be a corresponding impact of the assessment of the impact on your CLAR, which is there is a separate standard on compliance with applicable laws and regulations, and Companies Act 185. See, especially if it's a huge violation, I think you should take due cognizance. Other current assets, it's an inclusive heading which incorporates current assets that do not fit into other categories, unbilled revenue, unamortized premium, etc. Then the next is, from there on, it moves on to the liability side of the balance sheet. But here is where I stop today. So with a very short wrap up, that we've gone through these Excel sheets, which are the audit programs. We've looked at one very comprehensive inventory checklist, a very brief PowerPoint, which describes this, and most importantly, the Institute guidance note on Schedule 3. So there's a question which is on the cutoff issue. See, the client has raised the invoice before. Yes, I will be sharing this Excel template. I'll put it on the group. So I'll share the whole thing. I'll put it on the group right away. I mean, in fact, it'll even be there in the Google everywhere. So yeah, so this is a question that says, the client has raised invoice before 31st March and it is dispatched before 31st March, but not reached the customer before 31st March, asking the client to reverse the sales, which is not reached, but the client is not accepting. See, it's something like this. You have to see the contract of sale. So most contracts would say that when you hand it over to an independent transporter, the sale is complete. That's all. So please go back to what your definition. When do the risks and rewards of the sale finish? If the risk so today, if your client has an order from his customer that says delivered to that customer's factory location, then so whether it is FOB, CIF, delivered at factory location, or you hand it over to an independent transporter. Most cases I see are when it is handed over to an independent transporter, then you don't force your client to reverse the sale. That's it. Thanks, sir. So thanks, Mr. Ashok Kumar Madala. So I'm happy. I think I'm very excited doing this because I really think this is all what I happen to learn from my principal, and I'm absolutely delighted. And I must add in a small word, they don't really, although I try and ask my office to do it, I genuinely understand that as an SME, you really don't have the time. But one thing that I've been really worried about is the audit risk in the recent past. And I've said this multiple times, but please do read that NAFRA order on the large firms. It's very dramatic, and it very decisively shapes the way everything is going to be looked at. And again, I've mentioned all this. How much do you do this checklist? Decide whether your client is a public interest entity. Does he have a lot of employees? Does he have share capital? Does he have deposits from the public? Does he have bank loans? Categorize. It must ring a bell and you start. As major, medium, and small unit asks us to give the MR letter for the audit, they will sign and hand over to us to complete the audit. Correct. So why is a management representation letter important? Because see, anyway, your client is signing the financial statement, but in his signature, he's not saying true, fair, correct, and all that. So when you get an MRL, it will say clearly, asset, everything is correctly stated. And in the MRL, put as much as you want. See, the institute is a brief template. I'll try and fish out the representation letter template also, and I'll share it towards the end. So yeah, so a lot of these things you tell the client, this is my institute protocol, you have to sign this. You have to sign the engagement letter, you have to sign the MRL. That's it. Yes, Mr. Kumaravelu, you have to get the MRL signed, management representation letter. How do we address operational fraud? Product sold by employee to his relative with unauthorized excessive discount. See, this is something that the promoter will be very excited to know. That's number one. Because if one of his employees is frauding him, that's one. Secondly, if you're going strictly by the book, there is a clause called 143(12) of the Companies Act, which talks about fraud reporting. Less than 1 crore, what do you do? More than 1 crore, what do you do? It is very clearly defined in the reporting aspect on 143(12). You have to comply. So, but my first suggestion is you bring it to the attention of the director and start a recovery, because then they will understand that as an auditor you've highlighted this and they've actually recovered the money. Thanks, Mr. Prem. Thanks, Prem Sebastian Anthony. Very good topic on the eve of CA Day. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Kumaravelu, sir, and quite a few. Yes, I will share this Excel template to Jane Shilpa, but I'm going to put it on the WhatsApp group. But if somebody specifically hasn't received it, then you please send me a mail. I'll just type in my mail ID. Especially because of the lockdown, I manage all my mails myself. Anyway, I manage my mails myself. So if you just send it to me in a minute, I can just send it to you. Thank you, Mr. Anand. Thanks, Krishna Kirtana. She has a query. If directors, promoters pay for operational expenses, purchase of assets, etc., on behalf of the company, no, that becomes a loan from a director. You have a problem there, right? Loan from a director. So what will be the entry that you will pass? You will pass fixed assets debit to director credit, right? But loan from a director. So this is regarded as a loan from a director, but it attracts other provisions. It will attract your acceptance of deposit provision unless your director gives a declaration that such transaction, which is in the nature of a loan, has been undertaken out of his own funds and not out of borrowed funds. So there is a section 73 compliance, Krishna Kirtana, you need to examine. Please be careful. Okay. So see, there are three ways. I bring in share capital directly, I bring in loan directly, or I pay for something and take it as a book entry of a loan. In both 2 and 3, acceptance of deposit will get attracted unless there is a declaration that it is out of owned funds. Please get a declaration. That is more than enough. If he gives a wrong declaration, you can't probe it. But if you are also the auditor for his personal accounts and he has actually got a borrowing based on which he has paid this, then it will come under a deposit violation. Please be careful. I can handle this separately, Mr. Kirtana. If you want, you tell me. I can explain this to you separately, but please do read section 73 too. So please remember, loan from directors relatives, trade advances pending for more than 365 days. So today, if you look at all these jewelry companies, correctly, they'll finish the chit scheme in 360 days so that it doesn't become an acceptance of deposit. Another thing, maybe on the last day, if I have the time, I'll walk you through the special aspects. Share application, money pending allotment. Section 73 is very important for most of us. Thanks, Mr. Ramdas. Thanks, CAS Harsha. Very nice. He's a new entrant, and in fact, that's what I keep saying. I'll be more encouraged if a lot of young members come. For example, I started out, I did it in a firm where I never learned income tax. So some of us come from firms where we may not have done. But I think this is a huge area. Look at it this way: there are 18 lakh companies in India. They all need an auditor. And today, the distance barrier is broken. So you can audit a company in Bombay also. Just go right ahead and take it with confidence, but just take care. The next question is, deposits are defined as amounts received. See, it is also to be read both ways. How are you parking the entry? It's anyway in the character of a loan only, no? So it is deemed to be received is my interpretation, sir, but we can look at it. Because otherwise, somebody pays for, see, insofar as you're not recognizing a liability to the director. So Mr. Ramakrishnan has asked, deposits are defined as amounts received. But in the case of expenses paid by a director on behalf of the company, will it be amount received? My point is, yes, because it's the spirit of the law. Whether he pays the company and the company has paid the expense, or whether he has paid the expense directly, the entry that I pass is giving him a credit. The credit is to loan from director. In that circumstance, section 73 will apply. That's it. Yes, I will share the template, please. So let me go from the bottom. Yeah. Can we need to consider the reimbursement to directors under sections 269? I have to read 269 and come back. Is it 269? Okay, I'll read this and come back tomorrow. If the amount is material, does it require to be mentioned? So there are two things. Anyway, you have to show. If it's a loan to a director, see if it's a acceptance of deposit violation, then that DPT form, etc., everything have to be filled, right? It will be a much larger context. Yes, if it's material, you have to be careful. Please read that CLAR. Okay, that's the standard on auditing on compliance with laws and regulations. I am myself a little vague on that. But when in doubt, please be very careful, especially if your client has a large bank borrowing and there is a loan to a director. Please be very careful. If a director takes advance from the company for expenses but not submitted bills, yes, it straight away attracts. If a director takes advance from the company for expenses but not submitted bills for the spends, if the money is material, does it require a mention in the audit report? It amounts to loans and advances to a director. Yes. Please look at section 185 of the Companies Act. It says, notwithstanding anything contained, no company shall give a loan to a director or his relative. Now, if he doesn't give the bill, what is the meaning? It's only a loan, right? He has to give the bill, he has to settle it. You have received the invoice, but goods not received. Okay, so it's goods in transit. So that means this is, in your case, it is purchases in transit. So see, one advantage you have as an auditor is you go much later, correct? In March, it is in transit, but by the time I'm auditing in May, I have the test of subsequent receipt, right? See, which is the biggest, nicest thing about the audit. So you have this test of subsequent collections. Today, forget everything else. How will I audit my receivable? My client is showing receivable of 30 crores. I'm going to audit in June. I'm extremely happy. Now, client's 30 crores, all I will say is, show me has the money come later. If 28 crores has come later, then I know the receivable was a good receivable. That's the easiest way to do an audit. So for liabilities, the test of subsequent payments, and for receivables, the test of subsequent realizations. Similarly, for goods in transit, for purchases in transit, the fact that it has come subsequently means it did exist in transit as of the balance sheet date. So those are very powerful tests. The So today, again, tomorrow when I'm talking about liabilities, I'll tell you. The most important thing about a balance sheet today is unrecorded liability. Search for unrecorded liabilities. Most important. Whether it's contingent or a defined liability, we'll go into that tomorrow. But I hope this question was answered. There's a TDS credit in 26 AS, but the transaction is not related to the entity. How to deal with it to avoid in toto any correspondence? So you can just give it as a note to the account if it's a material number. See, it is after all sitting only in a memorandum record, which is 26 AS. I don't have to pass any entry for it. So you just give it as a note to the account and leave it. That's it. That also, if you feel it is important, otherwise you write and leave it. That's it. Is it mandatory to charge interest for the loans made by the company under 186? Will it amount to a violation? So, see, again, this is better addressed. So you have one clause in Caro, right? Are there any transactions which are prejudicial to the interests of the company? Would it not get covered then? I will clarify this tomorrow, but for a first pass, you cannot do this. Because as I explained before, you subscribe yourself to be a joint stock company, then certain controls are important. Why would you give an interest-free loan to anybody? One of the reasons why I'm saying this to be careful is because it's anyway come in the next year's Schedule 3. They say, are there any loans and advances given to anybody which does not have a defined terms and conditions of repayment, etc., have to be reported. Yes, in my opinion, it may not come in as an 186 violation, but why would this not come under your proprietary inquiries in 143? It's not done, right? If the company is in non-compliance of MSME Act, not paying in 45 days and any interest, you have to book the interest. You have to charge the interest unless there is a specific waiver from the customer, and it will also be reported in your disclosure that you have defaulted in the payment of MSME dues. Yeah, you have to. The next question. So the previous question was asked by Mr. Vittal. If the company is in non-compliance of MSME, you have to report it as such. The next question, which was Mr. Srinivasan says, there is a Form 26 AS in which there is a wrong credit to the company in which your client. So you obviously have to write to the deductor. That is a different issue. But since it does not have an accounting impact, you may just leave it as a note, a disclosure in the accounts and proceed. Because I don't pass entries based on my Form 26. I pass entries as a consequence of which Form 26 emerges. I deduct the tax, remit the tax, and file a 26. If the promoters have incurred some expenses during incorporation, it has to be treated as pre-incorporation expenses. You can take a liability to the promoter. My gut feel is at that point in time, again, you must read section 73. It may not even attract, it will just come as a liability. I can advise you separately because it talks about at the time of giving money or receiving money, was he a director? If it's a pre-incorporation expense, he may not have even been a director because where is the question of a director before a company is incorporated? So I don't think this is a problem. If the customer waives the interest, yeah, it's fine. If you've made the payment and waived the interest and cured the defect, play it by the year. That's about it. But get a very clear letter for interest waiver. So that was Mr. Vittal's question. He said if the customer has waived, it's fine. That's not a problem. Thanks, Shubha. Nice compliment. Yeah, see, again, Mr. TRL's question, I will take it slightly later. Some of these I'm now registering. So I'll make a separate note of some of these aspects in relation to interest-free loans received, interest-free loans given. See, interest-free loan, if my client receives, I'm happy, I'm okay. Insofar as it's clearly documented, it's interest-free. But when I give an interest-free loan to somebody else, it becomes prejudicial. Like wholly owned subsidiary, yeah, we can look at the carve outs, but fundamentally, If my client has borrowed money, why should I give it interest free to anybody? So these are issues that you may have to cognize for. Because my problem is then your matching concept is not satisfied, correct? Where is my cost for my revenue? Or where is my revenue for my cost? Valuation of inventory in the case of a construction company, the separate topic by itself. It will one is your valuation for the purpose of your construction contracts, etc., and the second is your as-built value, which you will have to go with the relevant standards. Conversion of loan from director to equity, what is the procedure? However, you would convert a loan to equity, but it can't be a foreign loan and all that. So, in so far as it's not a FEMA issue, you can convert it to equity. I don't think there's a problem. Now, only thing is there will be a return of allotment issue. I can again check back on this. This will be for consideration other than cash, right? So, you will not have cash for the allotment. It will be a conversion. Interest-free loan will pose an income tax too because it's not an arm's length transaction. That was the word I was looking for. So whatever you do as a company, you have to maintain arm's length. In relation to assets or trading goods on high sea, how do you treat? You've received the invoice, but the goods not received. It's still a goods in transit only. That's what is important. Just check what is the point at which. See, you may have received an invoice. It means nothing. Please go through the relevant documents on when exactly the risk and reward gets transferred. Very simple. You only have to read the documents. Go strictly by the document. So that's about it. But most of these high sea sales happen on high sea. So the document would also reflect that. For recording a purchase, when does the risk and reward of ownership transferred to your client will determine the point of purchase and whether it's goods in transit. Similarly, when you have sold to a customer, the point at which the risks and rewards transfer is very important. So this used to be very famous. It used to be called mined and wined, in these large automobile manufacturers and all. So there'll be a material invoiced, not delivered. That's mined. Wind, V-I-N-D, is vehicles invoiced, not delivered. So I'll quickly cut everything and go and keep it outside my factory. My dealer will actually give a confirmation. He'll say, yes, it's for my sake only. He has removed it there and he's kept it there. And then after that, they'll slowly ship it. So they'll say, we have a shipping constraint. Again, I've heard this about these are examples, big examples of cutoff violations. So these companies that make tube lights and all that, I don't want to give the name. So apparently on the last day, they will hire vans. They hire 100, 200, 300 vans will get hired. They will ship all of it and put it inside the van. And that's it. The sale is recognized. And slowly the sale will happen. Which is why if you notice, the secondary and the tertiary sales will be very slow in April, May, June, because the primary will have all been pushed into the market. But these are all ways of doing business. So, insofar as it's not patently misstated. And the best proof is by June, have I got the money? That is the most important. Yeah. If the promoters of company have incurred some expenses and reimbursed subsequently, there's no implication. It's perfectly fine. Insofar as you've recognized the pre-incorporation expenses and you've recognized the liability and you're settling a director, it's perfectly okay. Is it prudent to cover since received or receivables up to the date of signing of balance sheet in the letter from management? Not necessarily. See, a client will logically say, you are the auditor. You please check in my bank statement. Why are you asking me to add that in the representation letter? That's one client. If I was a client, I would say that. Having said that, whatever you want, you get it done in your representation letter. You can clearly prepare and copy paste template also and put it there and say, out of the receivables shown for 30 crores in the balance sheet, 28 crores have been received in these bank accounts. Great. But if something is wrong with that, you can't say I relied on the representation. You should have checked it. See, again, one very big thing is this representation letter helps you for every other assertion, existence, rights and obligations, but it does not help you in the event of a fraud, which is why only your working paper will help you to say, no, I did my job well and there was a fraud that was beyond me. In fact, there was one article, I think, by the NAFRA chief on fraud. I mean, I'm not sure, but it was a very senior ranking official who actually kind of virtually, I don't remember the article, but very critical of the Kingston Cotton Mills and where we are and things like that. In fact, you should keep looking. There have been a spate of articles today, especially in Money Life and all that, on NAFRA, on audit failures, on independent director failures, etc., which have all brought a lot of new things into focus. Thanks, Mr. Ramdas. Thanks, Shivramakrishnan sir, for the question. Thanks, Harsha. Thanks, Mr. Madhusudan. So I'm just going to recognize the names alone, not necessarily Ramesh Kumar sir, Naveen Babu, Chandargi, Dinesh. I think I've read most of the names out. So, Mr. Ashok Anand Kulkarni ji, thanks. So thank you very much. Thanks, Alpa Shah. Thanks. Okay, one question. Can I say arm's length price of related parties as per TP consultant's confirmation? I'm relying on a TP report. Yeah. Look at using the work of an expert. Why should you even say that? See, again, in an audit report, please be very careful. Don't state something unless it is required as per Schedule 3. That's the other thing I wanted to tell you. Don't write anything extra. Whether it is your audit report qualification or your notes on accounts, we should stick to agenda. Don't make any positive statements beyond what needs to be made. That's it. So thank you very much. We've had about at least 80, 90 questions. In Karo, Mr. Anand has left an open question. So yeah, that's about it. So maybe tomorrow liabilities and expenses is much shorter. So maybe we'll just quickly go through Karo so that we are comprehensively there. And then the most important thing is your director's report and your auditor's report have to talk to each other. So that's the last part which I'll touch. Whatever I can think of, and then we can do some of these more elaborately. So thank you very, very much for this patient listening. And I'm very happy to have concluded this webinar. Thanks. Thank you.